Please join me in welcoming D.T. Max.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was definitely the most painful single transition that I've ever had linking my two books. Most people don't even try those, so I admire you for giving it a try, and thank you to Jonathan Dedmon for endowing this talk, and for all of you guys from, is this reading week or exam week or something? You've all torn yourselves away from something, I was told. What is the something?
The penultimate week of the final.
Ah, almost sounds like a DFW year, the year of the penultimate week of the final. I'm going to read you a little section, and then we'll maybe throw it open to questions and answers if I can answer anything. And I'll give you a little background on David. I suspect many of you know something about him already. It's usually what you know about David is inverse relationship to your age. And so with the septuagenarians, I tell the entire story, Passover-like. But you guys probably know a fair amount. So we'll keep it pretty short. So David is a child of academic parents. He's actually born in Ithaca, but he grows up in Champaign-Urbana, not that far from here, although in some ways I think worlds away. He's a smart kid, as you would imagine, although not top student in his class. Probably could have been if he wasn't high most of the time in high school. And also, I think, incredibly anxious. Really pretty early on in his life, he begins to experience severe symptoms of anxiety. And in high school, it's kind of a race between his enormous intellect and his incredible anxiety. And I don't know who wins, but he does wind up going to Amherst College. He misses much of his senior year in high school, actually, with uncontrollable anxiety. But I think in the style of the 1970s, he was never really quite diagnosed. I think his parents probably pretty good idea of what was going on. And they were quite a liberal academic household. But all the same, he goes to college really, I think, not having any idea of who he is. I think evidence of that is that when David goes to Amherst, he's dreaming of being a lawyer, which is hard to imagine, I know. Imagine David Foster Wallace as a lawyer. And then even weirder, he actually wants to be a congressman. He wants to be a congressman from your state of Illinois. So in a parallel universe, David Foster Wallace might have, been on the agriculture committee and voted on the farm bill. It's such a weird idea. But fate intervened in the form of really an untreated mental illness. And so he has two breakdowns in college. And he's ashamed of them, and he never really talks about them in interviews. You can look through all the interviews. There's really no clear statement of what went on. But he comes out of them a writer. I mean, he really isn't a writer in high school. What I've read of David's from high school would not make you think that this was going to be one of the really great American writers. But pretty quickly in college, he becomes, I think in some ways, I was on my college literary magazine, as good as any college writer I've ever seen. He writes a story called The Planet Trilithon, which is a thinly fictionalized account of being on an antidepressant, and it's really the only autobiographical thing David ever writes. Never reprints it, never republishes it. I don't know that he ever even talks about it. Something was, I think, found by a DFW fanatic in the archives at Amherst. For his senior thesis, David was always very competitive, and his college roommate, Mark Costello, had done a double summa with English and history. So David decided that he would do a double summa, and he does a philosophy thesis, and then he writes a novel. And the standard limitation for a novel in the Amherst bachelor's program was 50 pages, and he produced the book, The Boom of the System, about 550 pages. And those who were there at the time talk about David sort of coming out after a night in the library with 25 fresh, gleaming pages, which is, if any of you are in the MFA program right now, I know how you must feel. But it was a period of incredible productivity for David. But it also, in a certain way, I think, lays the seeds of his future problems. Because for David, especially in this time of his life, it's all inspiration. It's not rewriting, it's writing. Anyone who tells you, writing is rewriting, well, David didn't think writing was rewriting. Writing was writing. And in this period, I really think he's almost able to produce these things in a single draft. But that doesn't last forever, as we all know. He goes to graduate school after graduating from Amherst. It's a huge success at Amherst. It's really, in a way, his most fruitful and happy time. He wins, I think, 11 awards. Like, there's all these awards given in these old, Well, probably here too. There are all these awards given for things you didn't even know were virtues. So there's the Copleston Award in rhetoric, whatever rhetoric is. Who even knows, right? David Wallace wins it, and then he gets up and it's the Putnam Award in rectitude in conduct. David Wallace, rectitude in conduct, philosophy award, an economics award. And it becomes a joke at his graduation. It's just David Wallace, David Wallace, David Wallace. So off he goes to the University of Arizona in graduate school. And it's interesting. He wants to get an MA, really, an MFA. He's a child of academics. It never really even occurs to him, like, to just go somewhere and write. Like, he's always, writing is something you learn in school, and then you go and you be a teacher. I think he has enough instinct for his own kind of style of writing that he knows he's going to wind up having to teach, and he knows he needs a credential to do it. So off he goes, and I think this is an interesting time for him. He works on the stories that wind up in the collection Girl with Curious Hair. Absolutely terrific stories, but I think if you look at those stories, you can see a certain kind of pleasure beginning to fade for David, especially when you get to the last story, Westward, the Course of Empire. David is beginning, I think, to feel that writing isn't so much the solution as he thought it was. It's still, it's part of what saved his life when he's in college, but it's now becoming more complicated. And if you look at the stories, I don't know how many of you have read the collection, but there are different kind of takes on the postmodern story. There's one story in the style of Robert Coover. There are other stories that vaguely have a kind of Donald Bartholomew feel to them. And then there's a famous story at the end, which is really an attack on John Barth. And so David is sort of finding his way. He's sort of feeling himself in a cage, in a kind of an inchoate way. He's trying to knock his way out of the cage. He graduates, and he feels after writing Westward, the Course of Empire, as if he's written the last story he'll ever write. And so at 27, David is really, and thinks of himself as finished. He thinks of himself as done as a writer. Not really washed up exactly, but the pleasure is gone, and the simplicity of it is gone, and the clarity of it is gone. And he also has an enormous problem with Girl with Curious Hair, which is the following. David always found what interested him wherever he found it, and he never particularly respected whether it was, he was sort of everyone's nightmare in an MFA program, because if it was your story and he liked it, like it was like something from your past and he liked it, well, it became his story. And so, lots of MFA students at Arizona would sit down and workshop with David and be astonished to have, something happen in their childhood appear in one of David Wallace's short stories. But for him, it was all fair game. So when he's working on Girl with Curious Hair, he writes a story called, it's eventually called My Appearance. It's the story with the actress on the David Letterman show. And it has some wonderful dialogue spoken by this actress. And you really think, boy, this guy's just an incredible ear for fiction and for the way you translate real dialogue into fiction, because as we all know, it's not a one-for-one. The story was going to be published in Playboy magazine, which had a very good and very well-paying fiction section, and David was thrilled. And in June of 1988, it was all set for publication, but about a month and a half before, one of the editors at Playboy was relaxing at home, watching TV, and was astonished to watch the Letterman show and find the words that David's actress says in the story coming out of the mouth of an actress named Susan St. James on the Letterman show. So you can look on that as sort of a playful bit of postmodern poaching, but he had also given this actress a Xanax addiction, which if David had been a lawyer, he would have been able to tell you right off was libelous. So his publisher freaked. It's interesting. Playboy magazine, I think, on some level, understanding that nobody really read the articles, despite all those years of insistence, didn't worry about it at all. They just published it. They got no comments from Susan St. James or Susan St. James's people or anyone, because people don't really read Playboy for the articles. But the publisher, Viking, my publisher as it happens, freaked out totally. And they made David look at all of the stories in the collection, these wonderful, strange little postmodern masterpieces, and write this sort of painful 17-page memo where he explained where each story came from. And he did it very snoddily, so, he'd be like, there was a mention of Kierkegaard in one story, and so his entry would be, Kierkegaard refers to a true 19th century philosopher widely taught in boring academic programs. He would do this kind of thing. Right? So, but his publisher was not amused, and they canceled the book. And it was just an awful moment for David, who I think always had a very complicated relationship with authority. I mean, on the one hand, he thumbed his nose at it. On the other hand, he was sort of strangely respectful of authority. He used to call everybody Mr. or Miss or Mrs. until he was sort of told not to. So David, in part because of this, and I think in a way more than anything else, because he had written everything he wanted to write, decides to do something different. He quits writing and applies to graduate school in philosophy. he decides his mother was a teacher of English in community college in Champaign, and his father was a professor of philosophy at University of Illinois at Champaign. So he decides he's now, having done what his mother did, he's now going to do what his father did. And the little section I'm going to read you is from a kind of interstitial moment, if that's the word, bovine and spongiform. Well, that is hard to say. It's called mad cow disease. That's mad cow disease. Actually, I was just speaking in the medical school about the book, and I think you gave a more cogent explanation of it than I had. The year of the Purdue chicken. That was hard. That was good. So this little section is when David has applied and been accepted to Harvard for philosophy, but he hasn't gone yet, and he meets the writer Jonathan Franzen really almost entirely by mail, and David never really had friends who were writers, very very few. I think essentially for David, if he admired it, he wished he'd written it, and if he wished he'd written it, he was jealous that you had written it. So it was very hard for him to have writers. He didn't like the vibe. I mean, he just didn't, that sort of competitive vibe that's around. We were talking on the way up in the elevator, Tom Bissell knew David, was sort of a friend of David's. And I think one reason that Tom was a friend of David's was that I don't think Tom has that vibe at all. I think he feels, when you're with him, you feel a different, very supportive vibe. So for David, anyway, he does meet Franzen, and I'm going to read you how. And this is the publication of Girl with Curious Hair, which I think absolutely, in some ways when people say, well, what would you recommend I read? I find this in many ways like the most wonderful story collection that you can imagine. Kind of just an extraordinarily strange attempt to kind of break through the various problems of postmodernism, which really sort of obsessed David in this period. So we're in August 1989. 1989, David's 27, but he already considers himself washed up. In August 1989, Girl with Curious Hair came out at last. The stories in his first collection, W.W. Norton, the publisher's catalog, stated, could possibly represent the first flowering of postmodernism, visions of the world that reimagine reality as more realistic than we can imagine. Kirkus Reviews, though, found the writer too much impressed with his own gifts and with some current critical theory. It was, Wallace wrote to Brad Morrow, his friend and editor of Conjunctions, a real brown helmet. I've told my editor I'm just not going to read fucking reviews, good or bad, this time. A brighter spot was an essay by Sven Burkertz in Wigwag. Burkertz was Wallace's natural reader because he too was keenly interested in how writers adapt to a changing world. To the question, what is the fiction writer, the writer who would try to catch us undistorted in our moment, to do? What prose will raise a mirror to our dispersed condition? Burkertz put forward Wallace. We sense immediately that Wallace is beyond the calculated fiddle of the postmodernist. He comes toward us as a citizen of that new place, the place that the minimalists have only been able to point toward. The rhythms, disjunctions, and surreally beautiful, if terrifying meldings of our present-day surround are fully his. He is, for better or worse, the savvy and watchful voice of the now, and he is unburdened by any nostalgia for the old order. When I talked to Burkertz, he actually told me that he had literally been waiting for, he had an idea of what fiction should be in the late 80s, and he was waiting for a writer who could write that way. So when he started reading Wallace, he almost felt as if he had created him, like he had sort of willed him into life. Few other critics, though, felt as Burkertz did. Most newspaper reviewers skipped the book entirely, and those who wrote about it mostly evaluated the individual stories. Wallace felt that missed the point. Who cared if one story was better than another? The point was that the collection as a whole was meant to open the door to a new kind of fiction. A lot of it is like being told your soup needs less salt, he complained to one of his editors. Not that Wallace himself didn't have clear favorites in the collection. These are evident in an exchange of letters with Jonathan Franzen, who began to play a significant role in his life now. Wallace had never had close literary friends. He was too competitive, judgmental, and self-absorbed. The no-writer friends rule was not conscious, but grew out of his personality, and like most of Wallace's behavior, had a refractory edge. He also felt guilty that he felt this way, which made him all the more want to avoid the whole issue. But the past few years had been humbling ones for Wallace, and the humiliation had made him more open to other writers' writing. In fact, in such moments, some aspect of his self-loathing made him overestimate the work of others in order to diminish his own. Thus, during his time in Somerville, he's moved to Somerville to go to Harvard, two authors had earned his intense admiration. One was William Vollmann, whose collection, The Rainbow Stories, Wallace had read 3 times that spring in Galleys, and thought evidence, as he wrote to a friend, of the best young writer going. One novella in the collection simply separates sock from pod, he reported to Franzen, whom he wanted to turn on to Vollmann. Personally, I think I'm going to look this up a bit. I think the sock and the pod are the same thing. I don't know if any of you grew up on a farm. Anyone here grew up on a farm? Anyone grow corn? No, me neither. Okay, good. So I believe the sock and the pod are actually the same piece, but David was always sort of pushing a certain kind of Midwestern thing in both his correspondence, because most of the writers he knew had no idea what the sock and the pod was, and David had grown up amid the cornfields of Champaign-Urbana. So I think this is one he just snuck by. It was a phrase he loved, and I love it now, because it sounds like it should mean what it doesn't actually mean. In person, though, Vollmann was too odd for the basically bourgeois Wallace. The two had had dinner that spring in New York, and afterward, Wallace reported to a friend that his counterpart was more than a bubble-off plum, prefers bloody venison and chocolate cake washed down with stout for supper, speaks easily of blowjobs and coups while we're eating. Franzen, the more conventional of the two and a Midwesterner, was the better match for Wallace. For one thing, he was hungry for the company of other writers. A friendship for him consisted in equal parts of affection and challenge, a dynamic Wallace knew well from his days on his high school tennis team. Wallace had been exuberant the year before in his praise of The 27th City, Franzen's first novel. Now Franzen wrote Wallace after reading the galleys of Girl with Curious Hair from Norton to tell him that he thought that Wallace had written half of a great book. He particularly loved, he wrote the author, Here and There, the story of the young man who begins by trying to reinvent literature and ends up failing to fix his uncle and aunt's old stove. And he particularly hated the long, winding westward, Wallace's send-up / homage to John Barth, which he felt provided none of the nourishment of good fiction. For him, the heart of the story was the abbreviated end, where such games were forgotten. I don't know if you remember the story, but there's a kind of a second section where there's a character named David, and the tone is totally different. Anyway, Franzen wrote to Wallace, by merely abstracting the story, aren't you showing pretty much the opposite of what you're telling? That you're too impatient and too proud to do the stoop work of creating character, suspense, and emotional involvement? For something that's not metafiction, the piece as it stands is awfully short on those commodities. I think it should have been mailed to Barth, not Norton. Franzen felt he'd gone too far, which in his case is saying something, right? And crossed out the last line before he mailed it. But even so, Wallace, opening the envelope at Yaddo, where he was on a retreat, was stunned to read that Franzen had liked only stories 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8 in the collection. Wallace had never been written to in this way before. This Jonathan Franzen guy, he wrote to an editor in Mystification a month later, keeps sending me these 15-page missives describing how I violated every precept of fiction as a moral exercise and affirmation of life. His own favorite stories in the book were nearly the reverse of Franzen's. The one Franzen had liked, he wrote the editor, Here and There, had been part of the trade-offs he had had to make with Norton to get westward into the book. Here and There, he wrote his new friend, was nothing but sentimental, pretentious, pseudo-autobiographical crap. Yet he was happy to be attacked in this way. Just beneath his self-confidence was always plenty of doubt, and the attention was flattering. He thanked Franzen for his critique, adding that he found his extensively explained dislike for Westward fascinating. It was, in its violence, immensely gratifying. He hoped they could meet in Boston soon to drink or eat or whatever. Franzen, in turn, suggested a Red Sox game. This is my idea of male friendship, right? Meanwhile, Wallace was facing the reality that few readers cared as much as Franzen about his attempt to remake literature. He hoped for a tour to go with the publication of Girl with Curious Hair, but there wasn't much of one. He gave a reading at the Cambridge Public Library with a handful of people in attendance, including a schizophrenic woman who kept shrieking. He went down to New York and appeared with Vollmann at Dixon Place, a performance space. At the reading, Vollmann accompanied a story with a starter pistol shot into the air, Wallace covering his ears in pain. Afterward, he and his editor, Jerry Howard, and a few others. Went to Cafe Pig, a restaurant on Houston Street. Anyone been to Cafe Pig? Dan? Cafe Pig? No? No? Oh, man. It's gone now. Howard was unsettled to see Wallace drink 3 bourbons in dismayingly quick order, and then disappear downstairs into a bathroom for a half hour with a woman he remembers as a proto-goth girl with black lipstick. He realized that the innocent boy in the U2 t-shirt he'd met when he'd first become a writer was gone. Worse for Wallace, Girl could barely be found in bookstores. The book is not yet out anywhere in New York or Boston, he complained to his agent in early November, and apparently likewise in the Midwest. Curiouser and curiouser. The non-reception of Girl was making its author more and more upset. After all, he had no new fiction with which to follow it. He had risked a psychotic breakdown to create really serious work, and hadn't even gotten a review in the Daily Times. He inscribed a copy to a friend, the friend who would ultimately guide him into a 12-step recovery program, praising the pretty jacket, but adding, "This book is dying. You probably have the only copy in Tucson." Thank you. So that's David, before recovery, before Infinite Jest, before really, I think for most of us, the person we know as David exists. Kind of an unsettled, highly competitive, very agitated, and deeply serious writer. There's a letter he writes to this same editor, Jerry Howard, even earlier, where he says that he says, "I'm obsessed with what it is to be a person in the human condition." And I think in a lot of ways that's actually what this section is about. And I think part of his exploration with Franzen, which is on one level a kind of funny, chafing, athletic friendship, is also really about trying to find the principles behind, out of which he could continue or return to writing. So I'm open to questions now, except from Patrick, because Patrick and I are going to do something tomorrow, and you're all welcome to that as well. And I'll take Dan first, and that'll open the gates, I hope.
How do you think he turned out, his fiction turned out differently because of Franzen, that friendship and those conversations which continued for years? I think they had a real profound influence on each other, even as they denied each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely did. So the question is, how did Franzen affect David's fiction? In some ways, I might even say I think he affected it too much. During this, David has a breakdown shortly after starting at Harvard. I think he lasts about 5 weeks, and he winds up at McLean, the psychiatric hospital, and from there he goes to Granada House, the halfway house, which figures so dominantly in Infinite Jest. And while he's at Granada House and afterward, he and Franzen are very much in touch, almost always by letter. And he's also dating Mary Carr, the poet memoir writer, and both of them keep insisting that David has to think about fiction in a more sincere way, in a more straightforward way. I mean, there's different ways that they phrase it. I think Mary Carr writes an essay called "Against Embellishment," which is all about like simplicity and clarity. And then in her private conversations with David, of which she has many, she's saying, "Why are you writing like such an asshole? Why do you think it's so important to be clever? Why do you have to be the smartest guy in the room?" Franzen's approach to David, I think, was a little more careful, but it fundamentally was this phrase about doing the stoop work of real fiction. I think there's a very key phrase for both of them. And I believe that in the second part of Infinite Jest, you really see John and Mary's influence, really, in the character of Don Gately, who's certainly a character, this 12-step, this AA guy who's in charge of the halfway house and who takes a gunshot trying to protect his charges and lies there unwilling to take morphine or even aspirin. This is an important section of Infinite Jest where he's abiding the pain, and he knows he can survive any single second of pain. So, I mean, Gately is this almost Christ-like figure, is no one I can imagine David having even thought about before, one, his experiences in Granada House, but two, I think John's sort of insistence that his fiction is, violating every moral precept. I think it gets more complicated, Dan, later. I think when you look at books like Brief Interviews, the story collection that follows Infinite Jest, and you look at Oblivion and The Pale King, which is the posthumous novel that frustrates him, there, my opinion is that Franzen's message is a message that David no longer can really quite assimilate. That there's this one moment in David's life which corresponds to a moment in his own biography, in his own history, when he's in this halfway house, where there's enough tension between sort of sincerity and the comic impulse that you get this brilliant novel that's really split between the two. And that afterward, David never really quite figures out what it is that John Franzen, to the extent he's thinking about Franzen's fiction, and he's also thinking of his own needs, he can't really quite figure out what is it to write this way. What is the stoop work? Does he want to do the stoop work? What are the moral precepts of fiction? I mean, Brief Interviews, which is a book I consider completely brilliant, is very hard to fit into, what John is insisting in that letter that I read to you. Who'll be the brave second person? You have questions. Yeah.
Those, like, the grim letters about his romantic history that he gave
Uh-huh.
to, like, that girlfriend, where did you have access to those? Like, how
Yeah.
long were those?
In the end of his life. Well, he knows the end of life. When David is courting Karen Green, who he would marry, when he's moved to Pomona, the biography in short, you can read it all in the book. But basically, he goes to his halfway house. He goes to Syracuse, where he writes the rest of Infinite Jest, with no academic affiliation at all. Madly in love with Mary Carr. He gets hired by Illinois State University, which has a very advanced fiction program, although most people don't realize it. Much more advanced than any of the schools where you'd say, oh, that's probably a great place to be an experimental writer. The funny thing is David's really not an experimental writer by the time he gets there. But anyway, he spends, I'd say maybe 6 or 7 pretty happy years at Illinois State. And then he gets this offer from Pomona College to be the Roy Disney chair in fiction, which is something that David finds pretty damn funny. He tells people that when he gets to Pomona, he's going to, his chair, his literal chair in his office is going to be decorated with Goofy and Mickey and Minnie. And when he's there, he meets a woman named Karen Green. They'd had a little correspondence, I think, before, but Karen Green, a very talented artist, had taken David's story, The Depressed Person, and turned it into a kind of a panel. And the ending is different. In the ending of Karen's Depressed Person, the depressed person, the story is cured. Whereas in David's ending is completely kind of bleak, and there's this woman who's trapped in her own thoughts and her own failure to form connections. So David and Karen Green, they begin courting. And David's idea of courting was, I think, essentially like a day and a half. And then the relationship would last another day, and then you had the breakup. He'd be back on the street after the weekend. He talks about high intensity, low intimacy relationships. But he meets Karen, and for whatever reason, maybe because he's now almost 40, maybe because Karen's just the special person waiting for him out there, the pot for his lid, they fall in love, and before she commits to him in whatever way, he does send her, as you suggested, these letters called the Grim Letter 1, Grim Letter 2, Grim Letter 3, which I did not read. I think Karen Green has them in a box somewhere, but I can tell what's in them. They're about his history of depression and suicide attempts, and then also, I think he laid out all the skeletons in his closet, or at least some of the skeletons in his romantic closet. I'm sure they're wonderful letters. One of the terrific things they do, which I think captures in a way why their relationship was successful, is that she drew a picture of Satan on him, with a magic marker, and he insisted that she add under the picture of Satan the words, "But I mean well." And I think that captures how sophisticated she was in sort of, dealing with somebody who was one so full of self-loathing, but also so refractory, so meta. So, every gesture met by a counter response, every objection. If let's say he would say, well, okay, by writing these letters, I'm a better person than most people who would date somebody they don't know, who really just let that person take their chances. But then he would say, wait, if I think that, then actually I'm being even more manipulative than ordinary people, because I'm thinking of myself as a good person, but actually I'm no better than anyone else. I'm just trying to use another tool to ensnare her. And then you go, wait, But if I recognize that about myself, surely then I am a better person and a kinder and more generous person, because most people don't even think about these things. So anyway, that's an example of how his reasoning on these things would get so fraught. Other questions? Yeah.
Not really sure how to phrase my question, but like I guess I was wondering if you could speak to like in writing this book, how did you come up against like sort of existing discourses we have linking mental illness and like genius and the ways that like we sort of view them as things that fuel each other a lot
Sure.
of the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was, in writing this book, how did I deal with like the existing cliche or trope about the connection between mental illness and genius? And there's a book called The Savage God, which is about all the brilliant, I guess, brilliant artists of all kinds who've committed suicide. And certainly, it's been a cliche since the romantic period. I think the short answer is I ignored it. I mean, I didn't read The Savage God. I didn't care about The Savage God. And I do this in all my work. I just pretended like these were connections that nobody had ever made, and that I would make them in an entirely practical or de facto way. I would draw on no historical or communal or cultural assumptions about what could or should or must happen to David. There's no sentence in the book that relates David's probably bipolar condition, although it wasn't diagnosed that way, to other bipolar conditions. I do that for a bunch of reasons. One, it's just I'm just not interested in that. You'll find also very little in there about his actual technical definitions of his illness. I was very interested in how he described what he suffered from. There are some sections of the book where I was given a kind of an essay he wrote for a psychiatrist towards the end of his life, where he talks about his history of anxiety and depression. I don't know if those are accurate descriptions. People self-describe fairly inaccurately, but they were more interesting to me than the actual. If someone had given me the actual psychiatric logs, which I did not have, I wouldn't have made much use of them. I'm not that interested. It's not that I don't think it's valuable. Not that I don't think it saves lives. I'm much more interested in, say, AA than I am in psychopharmaceuticals. I mean, to me, AA is really fascinating. I knew very little about it when I started the book. I don't myself have addictions to alcohol or drugs, and so there's this mysterious process that by which sort of, by changing your attitudes and some sort of light sort of doff of the hat to God and a lot of talk, an enormous number of cups of coffee in the morning, with other people who had the same problem, like people actually come out of it, I won't say cured because I'm not quite sure what cured would mean here, but actually come out of it as non-drinkers for life. It saves incredible numbers of lives. It's even sometimes court mandated, which I find really bizarre. Because, there is no empirical evidence. There's no careful evidence, or there's empirical evidence because your friends have been in it. But, there is no, double-blind trial that's ever shown that AA works, but people believe it works, and a lot of people come out of it. That really interested me, like AA and writing. Not drinking, but AA and writing was really interesting to me. So I think in a bigger way, the book lends itself to a fairly standard understanding of genius. You have a guy who, when he's on, can produce 25 pages in a night. David's bipolar condition, I think, is complicated by the fact that, at least as I understand it, again, I didn't spend much time on it, he doesn't really have those descents after he's finished his work. What tends to make David suicidal, actually, is not really a failure to work. He seems to be able to absorb that. What I think makes him suicidal, actually, is social rejection, which is typical of a condition called atypical depression, if you care about the names. But so he breaks up with, he's in a relationship at the end of college with a woman. And, he's not particularly faithful to her. And I'm sure he gave her some of the world's most confusing signals about whether he wanted to continue with her after college. But of course, when she breaks up with him, he goes into a massive nosedive. A friend of his was there, which is why there's a good account of it in the book. And is sort of left kind of like without expression or affect, watching TV, just and then he has to check himself into a psychiatric hospital. And I don't think that corresponds to having finished work, which is what, for instance, you would more typically expect from a creative person with that kind of personality. You think that you think you finish Infinite Jest and you have a breakdown of some sort. That's not what actually happened with David. So in that sense, I think it slightly rewrites that paradigm. But in a broader way, I mean, I think, most people who know only two things about David, know that he wrote Infinite Jest and he hanged himself. I mean, that's, for them, the two are connected. Yeah. Yeah.
I found your comments on Franzen's influence on David very interesting because one of the things that David Foster Wallace is credited with is the sort of creation or the revitalization of the new sincerity movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, like when you were talking about Franzen and how it was kind of like an artificial constraint of sincerity, I'm wondering, are we operating under different definitions of sincerity, or?
Yeah, I mean, so the question is, I guess, relate Franzen, new sincerity, David, but I guess I don't think I think Franzen was actually pushing for something sort of different. I don't really know. I don't find Franzen's books particularly sincere. I don't see him as a part of that. I think what Franzen was saying is that is the classic job of the novel, the full exploration of character, and the way that the reader feels less alone in participating in this life on paper. This is the basic job. This is the moral job of the writer. This is what it means to be a moral writer, and David wasn't doing that job. I think David's interest in sincerity really came more out of his 12-step program. I think, the things that a lot of people know about David, like the Kenyon College address, character of Don Gately, I think they really come out of his life. I think they come out of his attempt to free himself from his addictions. His foremost addiction, he always felt, was to television. So I think for him, addiction was everywhere. It wasn't just drugs or alcohol. I think it was in the culture. I think also that for David, the new sincerity is a very complicated, is a complicated place where it winds up. I think a lot of people who sort of take that from David don't realize that may have been for David a blind alley. I mean, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men is lots of things, but sincere is not one of the things that I would call it. I mean, I think it's honest, and it's ironic, but not in the sense of Letterman type irony, but a dense literary irony. But I don't think I see it as sincere. So in that sense, also, I don't know that, you can read Pale King a number of ways, and I'm not sure David really returns after Infinite Jest to doing the sort of stoop work of creating character, at least not, I think, in the way that Jonathan would have appreciated it. Or maybe Pale King could be folded in some ways there. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about Chris Fogel. I always felt like Chris Fogel in The Pale King was the most autobiographical thing, Wallace.
So Chris Fogel's the guy with the anxiety, with the sweating.
The wastoid who watches.
Oh yeah, which they're all. I mean, The Pale King is interesting when it's not a finished novel, but 3 or 4 of the characters. There's a guy named Cusk, I think, who was uncontrollable sweating in high school, right?
Right.
And then there's this extremely nice guy. Is that Steck or Stike?
Yeah.
So he gets these are not huge overlaps. So one of David's, you want to call this traumatic, he would say it was a bit of pseudo-autobiographical, pretentious crap. But, David had, let's call it a somewhat traumatizing wedgie incident in junior high, which he gives to Stike. And I think he had a piece of himself that was sort of, Stikean in this excessive politeness and this whole, for him it was a little bit of an act. But I think he saw it as a part of himself. So, I mean, the Pale King lends itself better than any other book to the classic idea that, like, the authors and all the characters. I don't know how strong an idea it is, but I do think it's valid. Yeah.
What did you think about Eugene's Leonard character or other uses of David Foster Wallace as a character of culture?
I believe Jeff says it isn't, that Jeff Eugenides in The Marriage Plot is a character with a bandana. What is he, a philosophy student? And kind of has this sort of explosive discursiveness that we associate with Wallace. I think Jeff told me, if I remember right, that I think his quote to me was, "It serves me right for putting someone in a bandana." I don't know. He claims it's more Axl Rose. I don't know anything about Axl Rose, to be honest. But I think it's we can leave Jeff with his own version of the thing. But certainly it's also true that David is sort of a type. He was a type. And now now that so many people know about David, he's even more of a type. So it's hard to pull. I was on a panel where we had, who was it? Dana Spiata. She said that the character in her first novel, Lightning Fields, was based on David. But again, I think I think he's such a type that I'm not really sure that I could distinctively say that he is that character or not. It may in a lot of ways not something I worked that hard at in terms of my biographical work. He's definitely in a story collection by Franzen called Breakup Stories, which was published in the New Yorker, and I don't think it was ever reprinted. But if you want to have fun, read those. Read that collection. There's one story that's so much David that your jaw will drop. I mean, he just took things David said and stuck them in the mouth of his character. I forget the name of the character. It's in the book. Yeah, yeah.
Was there any difference in the way that Wallace approached writing short stories and writing these long, huge, heavy novels?
Yeah, so difference between how he approached short stories and novels. I don't think he meant to write short stories after he wrote Infinite Jest. I think that Infinite Jest really, I think Infinite Jest was the book. He understood himself to be in competition with sort of the big book writers, the big white academic book writers. Volman, Gaddis, Gass, Pynchon. These were the people he cared about. And when he looked at them, he could see that they didn't spend a lot of time writing short stories. The short story collection, Brief Interviews, he refers to it as basically some doodlings that he was doing while taking time off from the long thing. So remember, The Pale King, he almost as soon as he finishes Infinite Jest, he starts The Pale King. It's not something that I knew when I wrote the original New Yorker piece that every love story came out of. It's something that I learned when I was working on the book itself. And it's actually sort of stunning. There's a journal entry I found from David's, and I think it's dated in 1996, in the later part of the year. So it's only 4 or 5 months after Infinite Jest came out. And it's a journal entry where he says, "I've gone back to thinking IJ was a fluke. Infinite Jest was a fluke. I feel nothing lapidary inside." And I think he's already starting or trying to start on Pale King at this time. Or at least he's beginning to try another novel. So I don't think there's any ever period except this Girl with Curious Hair period where all he did was write stories. Some of the stories in Oblivion are identifiably pieces of The Pale King. There's a journal I saw where I can't remember which story it is. It might be The Soul Is Not a Smithy from that collection. I can't remember. It's in my book, and he basically crossed it out and wrote up above it in the journal, already used or something like that. So he basically sold it for scrap. David was on some level a very practical writer, living in a practical time, and he wanted to continue to appear in print. He knew the cost, just practical cost of not appearing in print. He knew he had to keep his name out there on some level, or as he would have said it, like give proof of his continuing genius, with all the burden that would put on him. So I don't know that he ever set up to do stories. When he goes on these leaves of absence, he has 2 leaves of absence after Infinite Jest. It's all about providing, I think he writes to DeLillo, some perfect work of book-length prose or something that's quoted in my biography. And so I can only imagine that he really did. I think Brief Interviews is brilliant, but I think he really must have I don't think he treated it as doodles, but I think for him it was not quite what writing nonfiction was. It wasn't quite playing hooky, but it had a strong hooky quality to it. And then he would offer it to his publisher because he knew that Michael Peach's publisher needed something to publish every so often. Yeah.
In your book, you spent some time on some of the things that he did or said that were perhaps kind of ugly. And I was wondering what that was like for you, negotiating between perhaps admiring him and then trying to explore some of the sides of his life.
Yes. So how do you do? This is a perfectly good generic question for a biographer. You go into a book and you love somebody's writing, and then you find out what a shit they are, and about how do you handle that? I love David, and I certainly don't love him any less for the things that he does in the book. To me, it actually would have been more surprising if he hadn't done those things. If David had actually been the sort of Saint Dave of imagination, this endlessly giving, post-aggression, new age, gentle guy who, let birds alight on his shoulders while cautioning people who ate chicken that it would be better to be vegans. I wouldn't really quite know what to do with that person. I mean, I didn't think I'd find that person. I should say, when I started the New Yorker piece, which was just right after his death, I knew nothing about David. I did not know he'd been depressed. I did not know that he had addiction issues. Maybe it's because Infinite Jest feels so non-autobiographical. I think you don't read it. Many books you read, you go, oh, you know, I mean, oh, little bits of the author here, little bits of the author there, right? But I mean, Infinite Jest is so weird, and so in some ways so non-realist that I don't think you make the usual assumptions about it. And then, you know, in interviews, David said convincingly enough, I guess, you know, I went to a lot of open AA meetings, and there's this line where he says, nobody's as gregarious as somebody who's recently stopped taking drugs, which I know to be true. So I thought he'd sort of just picked it up along the way. Didn't surprise me that that wasn't the case, but I hadn't really thought about it beforehand. I see him as sort of a Thomas Merton figure. I mean, I see him as somebody whose strength as a moral figure really comes out of the fact that, you know, I mean, I don't know that anyone's a moral figure at 25 anyway. I mean, I kind of think it's almost obligatory. There's some T.S. Eliot quote about how it's always pleasant to think yourself a rake when you're in your 50s. Meaning like that you were a rake. And so, I mean, there's a little bit of that. Was sort of I sort of assumed that. I guess that I also felt that that readers today are not readers in 1920 or 1870 who are shocked to find that the people they admire, who create the books they admire, have issues. You know, I mean, this sort of era of table talk biographies and lives and letters is, I think, so long ago now. What I was very concerned about was I didn't want to actually write a pathography, which is a book that turns somebody into such a shit that you hate them. I mean, that wasn't. If I'd done that, I would have felt like I had really failed. And I don't think the book makes you. I'd be shocked if the book makes you hate David. I don't think it does. I think it, or if it succeeds, it shows you somebody who actually worked harder. And I think this is one of the reasons David is interesting for so many people. I think he worked harder to achieve fairly ordinary results in his life than most of us have to work. I'll give you an example. Like, for most of us, empathy is not such a difficult concept. Like, I have small children, and they understand empathy. I mean, theory of mind, the idea that somebody, who you're talking to has their own emotions, and that the world is as real for them as it is for you, is not a hard concept. But I think for David, actually, it was sort of a hard thing to believe. I think he was very cerebral, obviously very cerebral. And in some ways, I don't think he was very connected to other people. So when David gives the kind of speech he gives for the Kenyon College address, like, if it came from me, I think it'd be boring and cliche. But from David, you understand he sort of climbed out of a dark place to be able to say it. And I think that actually was very important to the people who were there. And if you listen to the tape of the Kenyon College address, you can hear on YouTube, listen to the voice. I think the voice of David as he tells these fairly cliched anecdotes. When he was writing the Kenyon College speech, he joked with Karen Green, his wife, maybe his girlfriend at the time. He joked that she should stand up behind him and do a soft shoe routine because the whole thing was so drippy. But when you listen to it, it's not drippy. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Yeah.
I'd be interested in hearing about your process, first writing the piece, and then when you decided it could be a book, and
Sure.
challenges you faced, and tough path.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the process by which it became a biography. I had never wanted to be a biographer. I was not a biographer before, though I would argue I was not a science writer either. I think I was a man looking for his genre. But when I was asked by the editor of the New Yorker to write the piece on David, I didn't. And when David died, I remember, having kind of the response that a lot of people have. God, that was so sad. And I sort of wondered where that. I knew there'd been a novel. Where was that novel? I didn't know anything about it. Like, a writer hangs himself. It was sad. But I wasn't a reader of David at the moment. I had been a reader of him at different times in my life, but I was not particularly interested. I remember we're looking at Oblivion and thinking, So anyway, but as I began to sort of read about, not read, but sort of talk to people about David, I became more and more interested. And when I heard from friends of his that, that he'd gone off, this is a story I tell in the biography, he goes off of an antidepressant that he's been on for 20 years, mostly because he feels stuck with his novel, The Pale King. That was interesting to me. I mean, that made the whole thing feel different to me, that he had risked his health and his life because he couldn't get The Pale King right, was really something. I finished the first piece. It was long. I mean, these New Yorker pieces are very long. It's 10,000 words, which is, I mean, you know, this book is I mean, the world's shortest biography, but I think it's probably about, I don't know, maybe 80,000 words. So, but I didn't really, I mean, I knew I would have to throw that out to write this. There was a period where I didn't really want to write the biography, and then I started thinking about how I really wanted to read his books again, and how was I going to find the excuse to read Wallace's books again if I wasn't actually working on something about Wallace. And the response was really amazing to the article. Not, I think, because of me, but I think because interest and a sense of loss. David's death, I think, took a lot of people by surprise. I mean, some people just grieved immediately, but I think for some people it took a little bit of a moment because he'd not really been around. And in working on the New Yorker piece, I'd had a chance to read Infinite Jest properly and really get into it. And I thought, you know, this is, for me, you know, one of the things that matters a lot to me is I always like to learn when I do my books or my articles. That's why there is a connection between the two books, and it is sickness, you're right. But there's not much of a connection between a book about prion diseases and a family in Italy and a book about a writer who writes Infinite Jest and hangs himself. But I felt there was a lot more to know about David, and that he was touching on some of the biggest themes of my generation. He and I would be the same age, and so that was very important to me as well. And then, you know, I just started, and my test was, when I finished the book, I would have, you know, I had a lot of stuff I could have done. I said, if I finish this book and I still enjoy reading one of David's books, then I made the right decision. So when I finished the draft, I pulled out Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, took it on vacation, and was still astonished at how brilliant and interesting it was. And then I felt like I had made the right decision for me in writing the biography. Should we do, I don't know, do one more? It's 7. What's our constraint? Do maybe one more?
Sure.
We'll do a couple more. Okay, yeah.
This might come up in more detail tomorrow, but I think something that your book shows, like, on that one cannot necessarily distill from his published work is his intensity as a teacher.
Yeah, actually, I mean, so you may all know this, but Patrick was a student of David's at Pomona. And tomorrow's session, what time is that?
It's at noon.
At noon.
In this room.
Oh, in this room. Oh, okay. Well, that makes it easy. You can all just pull out your sleeping bags, and we'll be serving hot breakfast. We could talk about it a little bit more there, because Patrick would have direct experience, but he certainly, I mean, he was a deeply committed teacher. Patrick knew him towards the end of his life. I think he had different phases as a teacher, and we can talk about that a little bit more tomorrow as well. If you go online in preparation for tomorrow's session, there's lots of his syllabuses, if you'll permit me that one, for you to get on. So they're really cool. Yeah. One more? We touched the end of it? Yeah.
I was just wondering if this is kind of an open-ended question, but if you could talk a little bit about him as a fiction writer versus him as an essayist.
Sure. I mean, it's a good question, because a lot of people first meet David as a nonfiction writer. And beyond that, there's a lot of people who quietly, if you give them a third beer, will confess that they don't like David's fiction. What they like is his nonfiction. Now, the reason that's hard for me is, you know, as the kind of writer I am, that is to say, a writer at a rigorously fact-checked magazine, you know, a lot of things David wrote verge on the invented in his nonfiction, which is why whenever journalists say, come and talk to us about David, I'm like, no, you're not. You will not find that when you go out in the world, because he didn't find that when he went out in the world. Now, it's a little unclear what is real, and I'm not saying he invented these things out of whole cloth. He didn't. But I think when the event didn't present itself from time to time, you know, he kind of embellished it, improved on it. And I know as a longtime journalist, you know, you can go out 100 times and very, very few, even David was a good listener, which is a great quality in a journalist. He could sit quietly and, you know, he could find what needed to be found. But still, I don't actually think that, you know, I don't know. You don't know what's made up when, that's the other thing about a memoir type writer as well. I mean, there's a wonderful piece he wrote about tennis in the Midwest where he claims he was born in Philo, Illinois, right? You'd think, now that was for Harper's. Harper's is a fact-checked magazine. I don't know why they didn't ask him whether he was born in Philo. I guess you just assume that an author's not going to lie about his birthplace because it's so damn easy to check. I think, so David always put down his nonfiction. It was always this thing he was doing. It was just one step above letter writing. It was this thing he was doing because he couldn't work on the novel. Clearly the nonfiction, I give the cruise ship piece to lots of people to read, a supposedly fun thing. And I think you can argue, and I mean, I think it's not really inarguable that the nonfictions had a far greater effect on general readers than the fiction. I mean, anytime, I don't know if you have this experience, but 9 times out of 10 when you send someone Infinite Jest, you're kind of wasting their time. I mean, you need a toolkit for it. You need a personality, a toolkit, a time of life. I'm not saying it's only young people who read it. There's a friend of mine in New Jersey whose father, who's 90, just read it and loved it. But I think for most people that's not the response. Whereas the nonfiction is really available to everyone. But I have to say, for me, it's hard. It's hard for me to understand how you talk about it. His editor at Harper's, a very smart guy named Colin Harrison, said that we should regard David's nonfiction as literary performance rather than as nonfiction in the conventional sense. And I mean, that may be good enough. I mean, not everybody has to put these things into neat little, pigeonholes. And his literary performance, something more like David Sedaris maybe does, and other memoir writers, especially, the classic, somewhat exaggerated, implicitly exaggerated memoir. I think there he possibly lives more comfortably. But those are pieces I give people. I mean, consider The Lobster. I find an absolutely brilliant piece of writing and a very, 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 very clever way to, for me, if I had that assignment, what would I do? I mean, the way he sort of stakes out the territory, I just find brilliant. In some ways, the best writing. I mean, I think you could say on the level of the sentence, some of David's nonfiction. I was just rereading the, that because I've been traveling a lot. There's that wonderful Condemnation of Tourism. Do you guys remember that? It's one of the most. Take a look at it. I don't have it handy, but it ends with, tourism makes you economically indispensable and existentially repulsive. And then he adds an insect on a dead thing. So I was with my family and we were in Arizona just a week ago. And we would go places and we would just look at each other and go, insect on a dead thing, and it was just nod, we go somewhere else. Like that, I mean, the writing is stunning. I mean, you look at the passage, call it up. It's or just, if you want, just for a little bit of fun, look at his description of academic prose. There's an absolutely brilliant sort of 17 adjective long put down of academic prose. I mean, okay, so maybe he did embellish stuff. Like, you can't ignore that kind of superb use of the language. I mean, that's what we're all trying to do, is use the language superbly. And the gift is just astonishing in those sections. Really, the tourist thing is just, you think you've read about, you think, the other thing about David is that, these are old stances, like to be against cruise ships and pleasure. These are old stances. It would have been more innovative if David had found in those people, those fat people amusing themselves to death, something brilliant and inspirational. That would have been innovative. So it's really the words and the intensity of the stance that are distinctive. Tourism. I mean, who isn't against tourism? Isn't that just a classic sort of snarky 17-year-old opinion when, like, you go to Europe with your parents? But it's the way he writes it. That's what nails it. And I mean, take a look at it. There's a wonderful moment, I think, in that particular passage where he talks about always being disappointed. But you get this sense that for David, he was really hoping. That's, I think, if you look at that passage, what makes that passage so heartbreaking is, and I think that you can extend that to a lot of David's life. Like, he's always hoping to see something that other people have told him, you won't find there. I'm ready to pack it in if Dan gives me the thing. Thank you.